What if I told you that you have $1 million or maybe even $2 million that you never thought to calculate? It's not in a 401k, it's not in savings, it's in income streams that you've already earned. So I know you're wondering, okay, Ryan, why is this important? Well, it's important because most people make their biggest retirement decisions based on what they think they have. So someone with a $900,000 401k and also a solid pension can actually be in a stronger position than maybe a neighbor that has $1.5 million saved, but they don't have any guaranteed income. And this is even though the balance sheet may make it look like, the opposite. But most people never calculate the full picture. So I want to show you the math here. So Bill was 63, he was still working. Mary was 62, she was already retired. And by the way, those aren't their real names, but the numbers here are real. They had about $1.3 million saved, and most of it was pre-tax in Bill's 401k. And by most measures, they were in solid shape. But when we sat down and we really mapped out their full retirement picture, I showed them something that they just hadn't seen before. So Bill's Social Security benefit at his full retirement age of 67 is $3,400 a month. Now, most people think of that as a monthly check, which it is, of course. But there's another way to think about it. So if you needed to generate $3,400 a month from your own portfolio, and if you use the conservative 4% withdrawal rate, you need to have saved about $1,020,000 saved in order to do that. Now, that's the lump sum equivalent of his Social Security benefit. Over $1 million in guaranteed income that doesn't show up anywhere on a balance sheet. And that doesn't even fully capture the value of the annual cost of living adjustments that Social Security provides. Looking at Social Security's own historical data, the average COLA has been right around 2.5% going back to 2005, which means that the real purchasing power of that benefit holds up in a way that most other income sources simply don't. Now, nobody can predict exactly what Social Security looks like decades from now, right? But these are the numbers that are on the table today, and they're worth calculating. Now, Mary's Social Security benefit at her full retirement age is $2,700 a month. So let's use the same math. So $2,700 times 12 is $32,400 a year. And at a 4% withdrawal rate, you need $810,000 to generate that. And Bill also has a pension of $800 a month starting at 65. So same calculation here. $800 times 12 is $9,600 a year. And at that 4% withdrawal rate assumption, that's another $240,000. And so if we add it all up, that's just over $2 million, which, of course, coincidentally enough, is exactly where the title of this video comes from. Now, this is all in guaranteed lifetime income streams that they had already earned. And again, none of this shows up anywhere on a balance sheet. And it's not something that a lot of people, and certainly them in their case, had ever thought to calculate in this way. So when they walked in thinking that they had $1.3 million, they actually had over $3 million in total retirement assets. The $1.3 million that they had calculated, right, in their accounts, and just over $2 million that they hadn't calculated in this way. All right, so let's go back to, again, why does this matter beyond just an interesting calculation here? Because the decisions people make heading into retirement, when to retire and how much to spend and how much risk to take with their investments, and also whether they even have enough. All of these decisions are based on what they think they have. And if you're only counting your 401k and your savings, then you're making those decisions with an incomplete picture. I've seen people delay retirement by years, and it was completely unnecessary, but it was all because they were chasing a number that didn't account for the income that they had already earned. They looked at that neighbor, right? You're at that backyard barbecue, that people are talking, and it gets out, with somebody's 401k balances, and all of a sudden, you start getting in that that position or that feeling that, well, maybe it's not enough. And that was the case with these folks. They looked at that neighbor who did have that 401k balance and assumed they weren't ready. But that neighbor didn't have a pension. They didn't have the same guaranteed income floor. And so the comparisons here were never apples to apples. And, other times, some people underspend throughout retirement, just living more cautiously than they need to because the full value of what they actually have was never fully considered. So when you see the complete picture, right, all of it, the decisions look a lot different. So if we take investment strategy just as an example, when a portion of your income is guaranteed for life, regardless of what the market does, it changes how you need to think about your portfolio. You're not forced to sell investments during a downturn to cover expenses. That guaranteed floor, it gives you more flexibility to ride out volatility. Now, there's an important distinction here that most people don't think about, and that's the difference between risk tolerance and risk capacity. So risk tolerance is what most people are all familiar with, right? This is how you feel about market swings. Risk capacity is how much risk your actual financial situation can support. So a lot of people retire and then immediately think they need to get more conservative. And emotionally, that certainly can make sense. But if your guaranteed income covers a meaningful portion of your expenses, and if your withdrawal rate is low, then your risk capacity might actually be quite high, even if your risk tolerance isn't. So those are two different things. And if you confuse them, this can cost you significant growth over the course of a 20 or 30-year retirement. Now, by the way, if we haven't met yet, I'm Ryan Kravitz. I'm a certified financial planner, and I help people transition into and through retirement. And here's the thing that most people miss here. Knowing what you have is only half of the picture. The other half is knowing how to protect it, because those income streams can be worth dramatically more, or they can be worth quite a bit less depending on the decisions that you make in those years right around retirement. So let's talk about Bill and Mary again. So for Bill and Mary, those decisions came down to a 2-year window that most people never see coming, right? So for Bill, he retires at 65, and their income essentially disappears for 2 years. Right? They have no paycheck, no Social Security yet. That doesn't start until 67. At least that's the plan. Just the pension, which is $800 a month. To most people, that looks like a gap to fill, but to us, that looked like a window, an opportunity, because in those 2 years, with almost no taxable income, they could convert a significant portion of that pre-tax 401k over into a Roth IRA at the lowest tax rates that they'll likely see for the rest of their lives. I mean, we're talking about staying in the 12% tax bracket for the vast majority of their retirement, rather than climbing into the 22 and 24%. This is based upon where current tax rates are today. Anything could change in the future. So in their case, converting roughly $130,000 the first year and $118,000 the second year was the plan. I mean, that was the opportunity within this window. Now, without that window, that same money will eventually be forced out as required minimum distributions at a 22%, 24%, potentially higher as the account grows untouched and RMDs push their income higher and higher year after year. And of course, I'm only talking about federal taxes. Of course, if you live in a state where state taxes apply, that's another wrinkle in this. Now, speaking of wrinkles, here's another wrinkle. That first year, Mary is still 64. She's not yet on Medicare. So we have to be careful about what the Roth conversion does to her healthcare costs, specifically keeping income below the threshold where ACA subsidies phase out. Now, that may mean a slightly smaller conversion that first year and extending the strategy into a third year. So some of the numbers that I gave you earlier for that first year, maybe adjusting that, maybe not though. So staying with this, depending on the situation, delaying, Social Security perhaps by even one additional year can then extend that low income window even further and then maximize the conversion opportunities before Social Security income, narrows the bracket room. These are the levers, and knowing which ones to pull and when is exactly the kind of thing that requires looking at the full picture. Even after accounting for that healthcare consideration, the projected tax savings over the course of their retirement comes to over $350,000. Now, here's what that actually looks like in real tax terms. So without doing the conversions, Bill and Mary start retirement in a relatively low bracket in those early years. But by the time RMDs kick in and then force larger and larger withdrawals, they then climb to 22% in their mid 70s, and by their late 80s, they're at 24%. I mean, every dollar coming out of that IRA is taxed at rates that were completely avoidable by doing earlier planning. With the conversions, they stay at 12% essentially all the way throughout retirement. I mean, the same income, but a fraction of the tax bill. More flexibility now to pull from the Roth in any year without it then pushing up their tax bracket, or maybe triggering a Medicare surcharge, or making more of their Social Security taxable. Same couple, same savings, same income needs, but completely different tax picture for the rest of their lives. All because of 2 years of intentional planning inside a window that quietly opens and then quietly closes before oftentimes most people ever realized that it existed. Now, Mary had inherited $200,000 from her mother, and it had been sitting in the savings account. And so rather than pulling from their 401k to cover their living expenses during those 2 years, which of course would add to their taxable income and compress the conversion window, the plan is to use that savings to cover their costs instead. And then that keeps their taxable income low and keeps them in the 12% tax bracket, and then lets them then move a meaningful amount into tax-free growth. Now, not everyone has an inheritance sitting in savings, but most people approaching retirement have something that functions in the same way, right? Maybe it's a taxable brokerage account. Maybe it's just cash savings in the bank, right? It's something where you have a bridge between now and Social Security. And so the question is whether you've identified what that bridge is in your own plan and when you're going to use it. Because here's the thing, that 2-year window between Bill's retirement and their Social Security start date, that window exists for a lot of people, but it only works if you see it before you retire, not after, not some years later. Now, once you've claimed Social Security, once the paychecks have stopped and the patterns have set in, well, the window, it oftentimes doesn't reopen. All right, so here's what I want you to take away from all of this. First, your retirement assets aren't just what's on your brokerage statement. They include the lifetime value of every guaranteed income stream that you've earned, including Social Security, a pension, and anything with a guaranteed monthly payment. Now, when you calculate those the right way, most people find that they have significantly more than they realized. And inside that bigger picture, there's often windows, opportunities to reduce taxes or optimize income and protect what you've built. Most of those windows are time sensitive, and most people don't find them until it's too late to use them. If you're within 5 years of retirement, or if you've recently retired and you've never sat down and really mapped this all out, it's worth doing. If you'd like to do that with me, I've added a link below where you can get started. I'll see you in the next video.